From the New York Times, I'm Michael Barbaro. This is The Daily. Today, even as well-known Democratic lawmakers failed to qualify for tonight's debate, Andrew Yang did. Kevin Roos on what has made Yang's campaign so compelling. It's Thursday, September 12th. Kevin, tell me how you know Andrew Yang.
So I met Andrew Yang a few years ago when he was running this organization called Venture for America, which he had a couple careers. He was a corporate lawyer, did some startups. He actually sold one of his startups and made a decent chunk of money from that. And then he was trying to do this thing where he would essentially turn like recent college graduates into entrepreneurs, set them up with some money and supporting them as they went off and started companies.
Kind of sounds like Teach for America for business.
Exactly. That's, I think, the pitch that he made. And so I was, covering technology at the time. We talked about Venture for America and, I found it interesting, but not really all that newsworthy. I didn't end up writing about it, but we kept in touch. And then, he emailed me sort of out of the blue in October of 2017. And it was a very cryptic email. He just said, let's get together. I've got a story to tell you. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I like to go on goose chases. So I invited him out. We went to Dean and DeLuca right downstairs from the Times building. And he told me that he was planning to run for president. And at first I was very confused. I was like, president of the food co-op, like the homeowners association. What could you possibly mean by running for president? He's never held political office before. I didn't even know he was particularly interested in politics. And he says, no, I'm for real running for president in 2020 as a Democrat against Donald Trump. This is not a joke or a stunt. And he's written this book talking about some of the big ideas of his campaign. And then I kind of forgot about him for a few months. And then he came back one day in 2018 and said, hey, I filed my paperwork and I've got my first campaign video.
Hello, I'm Andrew Yang, and I'm running for president as a Democrat in 2020.
So I watched the video and it was interesting. It was kind of homemade. It was not particularly high budget.
We are experiencing the greatest technological and economic shift in human history.
It was basically him talking about his sort of central message of his campaign.
I came to realize that technology has already wiped out 4 million manufacturing jobs in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and other states. And it's about to do the same thing to people who work in retail, food service and food prep, customer service, transportation.
And I thought it was sort of interesting. I hadn't heard a presidential candidate talk about issues like AI and automation, and certainly not make it the centerpiece of their campaign. And so I was intrigued. I mean, here was a guy who was talking about an issue that you hear about a lot in Silicon Valley, but it hadn't really become a mainstream concern yet. And so I wrote this story. I called him a longer than long shot candidate, which I thought was kind of being generous at that point. Mm-hmm. And then I kind of expected that he would sort of fade away into obscurity and that I probably wouldn't write about him again.
And it turned out you were kind of wrong.
I was a little bit wrong.
Please welcome Andrew Yang. Hey.
I would like to welcome to Crooked Media HQ, Andrew Yang.
The supporters call themselves the Yang Gang. They chant PowerPoint at his rallies and wear ball caps with MATH on the front for Make America Think Harder.
Can I just say, of all the candidates I've seen on the trail, you seem to be having the most fun, are you?
Oh, it's a very low bar you set, Trevor.
One candidate who will perhaps be a surprise on the stage for the next month's debates, and entrepreneur Andrew Yang, who made the cut ahead of several other Democrats with far more experience.
USA! 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 Are you chanting USA or US Yang? I couldn't even tell. Andrew Yang! Andrew Yang! Andrew Yang!
So I wanted to catch up with Yang again. He's, obviously his situation has changed quite a bit since our first meeting in Dean and DeLuca.
Hey, Kevin.
How are you?
I'm doing great.
So I flew to Houston where he was spending the week preparing for the presidential debate. Things are a little different. He pulls up in his big SUV with his campaign staff trailing behind him. And now you've got, travel with an entourage.
Such a big entourage.
You're in the debates. You've probably got, armored SUV out there waiting for you.
We actually just rented at Hertz.
And we sit down for this interview. And I asked him kind of straight up, like, where did I go wrong? Like, what did I miss here?
What do you say?
Well, I think what people missed, and unfortunately Democrats are still struggling to pick up on this, is a genuine explanation for why Donald Trump won in 2016, where if you turn on cable news, the message seems to suggest that he's our president because of some combination of Russia, racism, Facebook, the FBI, Hillary Clinton, emails. And so you're like, all right, I guess that's why. But the numbers, and I'm a numbers guy, the numbers tell a very clear and distinct story that the reason why he's our president is that we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in your home state of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, Michigan, all the swing states you needed to win.
He sort of said, well, it's not actually that hard to understand. You don't need to know a lot about computer programming or artificial intelligence to grasp that technology is having a huge influence on the labor market and the workforce.
You don't need to be into technology to see the self-serve kiosk at the McDonald's or at the airport or at the CVS or at any of the other places you frequent.
So Yang's diagnosis of the Trump election, and by extension, what's going on in this country, is that it stems mainly from technology, from automation, basically knocking people out of their jobs, and that his candidacy is compelling, in his opinion, because it directly confronts that.
Right. And I think if you've heard one thing about Andrew Yang over the course of this presidential campaign, it's probably related to his idea for what's called universal basic income.
Universal basic income, or what I've rebranded the freedom dividend because it tests better, is a logical next step.
Which is what?
So universal basic income is not a new idea. It's really an idea that goes back decades.
Where if we put money into people's hands, it has so many positive effects because it would create hundreds of thousands of jobs around America, but it also recognizes the kind of work my wife does, who's at home with our two boys, one of whom is autistic.
And the basic idea is every American adult gets $1,000 a month in cash, no strings attached. Doesn't matter if you're a billionaire or you're unemployed, you get the same $1,000 a month regardless.
And how's that paid for?
So he's proposing to pay for it through what's called a value-added tax, which is, kind of European-style tax that he thinks would most directly tax the companies that are profiting from automation.
And how exactly does that solve for the problem he's diagnosed of automation and its consequences?
Well, he believes that it doesn't solve the problem of automation, but it does give people a cushion. So if you lose your job because your company decides to replace you with AI, having $1,000 a month will allow you to meet your most basic needs while you figure out what to do next, while you look for a new job, learn a new skill, go back to school. Basically, that having $1,000 a month guaranteed as the floor would make it easier for people to adapt to this sort of unprecedented technological change. And he uses this example of a truck driver.
So if you're a trucker making $50,000 a year and then a robot truck comes and takes your job, now you are worth zero.
So truckers, obviously are threatened by automation. If self-driving trucks come onto the roads, millions of people would stand to lose their jobs as a result. And those people wouldn't just be able to immediately find something else that paid them as well as trucking that was suited to their skills. Like a lot of them would need some time to figure out how to adjust and what to do next. And to make that easier, we would give them and everyone else $1,000 a month. I mean, it's not $12,000 a year is not enough to live on, but it is enough to kind of serve as a net, so that they're not experiencing the most extreme financial hardship.
Where does Yang say that we are in this process of automation?
So he thinks we've basically only seen the tip of the iceberg. He, cites these studies from think tanks and academics that say 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 jobs in America could be at risk of automation within the next decade. And he's sort of using that to predict a mass unemployment crisis. He's not saying, this is going to be tough for a few people or a few people are going to have to find new jobs. This is really about millions and millions of people being automated out of work.
It's going to zero out not just the truckers or the warehouse shelvers or the retail workers. I was an unhappy corporate attorney for 5 months, which is long enough to know that AI can do that job. It can edit contracts more quickly and accurately and inexpensively than the smartest human lawyer.
And why this? Why $1,000 a month to people and not what we hear most candidates and a lot of policymakers talking about when it comes to automation, which is retrain workers whose skills have been supplanted by technology?
Well, Yang talks about this a lot. He believes that basically that reskilling programs don't work.
When I dug into the studies around the retraining programs for displaced manufacturing workers in Ohio and Michigan, you found abysmal success rates of those programs that were federally funded. The success rates hovered between 0 and 15% generally. Half of those workers left the workforce and never worked again. And of that group, half then filed for disability. And you then saw surges in suicides and drug overdoses in those communities to the point where now our life expectancy has declined for the last 3 years in a row. So if you say as a politician, we're going to retrain everyone, and then you come with me to the truck stop and you actually have a clipboard and say, who here wants to be retrained? You will see how dumb an idea that is in real life in many, many contexts.
And does that feel right to you?
Well, there have been some interesting studies about these retraining programs. I mean, I would say that they don't work, but they are definitely not the cure-all. I mean, there have been some estimates that only sort of 1 out of 4 people can be retrained profitably by the private sector, that essentially the government has to play some major role in trying to help people transition out of their old jobs and into something new. And what is it that having $1,000 a month would allow these people to do? Let's take the trucker. The 50-year-old trucker loses his job, probably a he, to automation. Now $1,000 a month shows up in his mailbox. What, in your mind, does that allow him to do that he couldn't otherwise do?
So first, when you're looking at something like trucking, the $1,000 a month is not enough. But I've been giving the Freedom Dividend, as you know, to several families around the country right now for the last number of months. And I just saw one of the recipients, Kyle Christensen in Iowa. So Kyle is living in Iowa Falls, Iowa, with his ailing mom who's recovering from cancer. So he's been getting $1,000 a month from me for a number of months. I just saw him a few weeks ago in Iowa, and he seemed like a different person. And he came to me and he said, I used some of the dividend on a guitar, and I've been playing shows for the first time in years, and this band now wants me to perform with them next week. And he was so proud and he was beaming when he told me this. The $1,000 a month is in many ways about everything but the money. It's about our humanity and what we would actually value. It's car repairs going from a crisis to an inconvenience. It's home repairs and going back to school. So when you translate what the money means in people's lives, it means the things that make us human.
Right. I mean, his argument is essentially that this would radically reshape society.
So if we had an economy that was based upon making us happy, then we would do this yesterday, clearly. Let's imagine I'm president 2021, Freedom Dividend goes out. There's a town of 10,000 people in Missouri. So that means it's another $10 million in spending power every month. And then one person there decides to open a bakery, which might have been a really dumb idea before the Freedom Dividend, but now it's a good idea. They open a bakery, it sells muffins, people like the muffins. Were there cheaper ways to get those muffins to those people? Probably yes. Like is the new bakery like somewhat economically inefficient? Perhaps, but does it make the community happy? Does it make the bakers happy? Does it make everyone's life better despite its economic imperfections? Yes. So that is the vision of the economy we have to move towards, and that certainly applies to creative and artistic and cultural endeavors too.
And the way that he's talking about it is essentially as something that would kind of change the way we value work in the first place. So, he brings up the example of GDP, gross domestic product, which is the sort of benchmark measurement we use to determine how well the economy is doing.
Right, productivity.
Productivity, essentially. And he thinks that's the wrong measurement.
And so the goal should be to try and optimize not for this GDP measurement or stock market profitability and prices. It should be to optimize for how we're doing, our health, our mental health, our childhood success rates, how clean our air and water are. And if we had those as goals, then we could harness our energies towards actually trying to improve our own lives instead of improving the bottom line of a company that is just going to proceed to automate more and more work as it's able to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the biggest misconceptions around me and the campaign and the freedom dividend is that people think it's somehow going to mitigate work. It will not. It will recognize the kind of work that so many of us are doing and want to do. It will create more opportunities for the most human-centered work, the caring, the nurturing, the artistic, the entrepreneurial aspirations. Just the question is, what do we mean by work? I know my wife is working harder than I am, and I'm running for president. And right now the market values her work at 0. So we have to think bigger about what we mean by work and value. And if we succeed in that, then we can create a society where more people who are going to be automated out of their jobs are going to go on to fulfilling lives that they're excited about, as opposed to right now, we're essentially kicking them to the curb, pushing them into the void, and then expecting that to go all right. And I hate to say it, but over time, them is us. And so we need to get our acts together and wake up to the bigger problems.